right. Today's study will be Genesis chapter 30. We'll title it Jacob's Seed Multiplies. In chapter 29, we read about how Laban tricked Jacob into marrying Leah instead of Rachel, and then told Jacob that if he wanted to marry Rachel, he had to work 7 more years to be able to marry her. And during that time, God had compassion upon Leah because Jacob loved Rachel, but loved Leah less. So God came up with a plan to kind of even the playing field out a little bit between the two sisters, is that he opened Leah's womb and she ended up having 4 children, and Rachel had none at this point. In this chapter, we're going to see it might seem kind of strange to us, but I think God had an overall plan here in place. But we're going to see a competition between these two sisters of who could have the most children with Jacob. And we're going to see that Jacob, throughout this chapter, he doesn't complain about it. He does as his wives tell him to do. And also we're going to see that in this chapter, we're going to see that polygamy is not necessarily a healthy thing because of the jealousies and things like that. So, but in this case, God permitted it, I think, for some special reasons. But I'm not saying I'm against polygamy. We shouldn't do that today. It should be 1 man and 1 woman. But nevertheless, that's how it was done back here during these times. Because they're even going to get their handmaids involved in this competition as well. Both Rachel and Leah, to try to multiply children to themselves by Jacob. I'm going to just pull this slide here. Whoops. Here we go. Just to get you up to date here. Leah, here's her scorecard, if you want to call it that. To them, this is a competition. Leah has Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, and Rachel, poor Rachel, his favorite wife, has no children with him. So Rachel's feeling pretty low right now, and Leah's feeling pretty good. Her husband now has to pay attention to her, and because she's got children there, and so forth. So anyways, let's back up to Genesis chapter 30, verse 1. And when Rachel saw that she bare Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister, and said unto Jacob, Give me children, or else I die. So she's really desperate right now. She wants children. She's to the point of his life is meaningless if I don't have any more children, or if I don't have any children. It's interesting when we see this chapter about how important children were for people back in these days. It's a lot different today. Now we look at children as liabilities. Oftentimes we look at them as, it's going to cost us a lot more money, And back then it wasn't so. I mean, the children were looked upon back here as assets. When you had another son or a daughter, it meant you had more workers on your farm or whatever business you were doing. But today, like I said, it's looked upon as kind of a burden because a lot of families have a lot of families have it where both parents work outside of the home, and now it's basically, and they do and they send the kids off to daycare. So you get to 2, and you really can't afford. Most people can't afford having more than 2 kids in daycare. So most families will stop at having 2 children, 1 or 2 children. 3 kind of seems like a bigger family these days. And if you get to 4 and 5, then you're almost outrageous in a lot of people's eyes. But yeah, so years ago, Nicole and I, we decided we wanted to have more than 2 children. We wanted to have at least, I think it was 3 or 4. But we wanted to figure out a way to do it, so we figured out, I had the Bible study ministry that I had started in its infancy way back then. So we decided, she was working at the local hospital here, so we thought, well, we can't have 3 or more children if we're going to have to do daycare. It won't work financially, so one of us has to stay home. And so I ended up staying home, working on the ministry, working from home, and homeschooling the kids so that we could have more children. It's not easily done for a lot of families these days. It's too bad. But anyways, the point is children should be looked upon as a blessing rather than... we need to rethink this as a society. The family's falling apart because of it. Because think about this. If you have 5 children, 7 children, 10 children, you have a lot to lose if your marriage doesn't work. Now today, if you only have 2 children, well, it's going to be a little hard. If things aren't going right between me and the wife, I'll just move on and find a new one, But if you got 5 children or 4 children or whatever, if you have multiple children, it makes you stop and think. Not that I'm thinking about it, but it's a little less tempting if you're in a bad situation. It's a little less tempting when you think, okay, I'm going to lose all that for that. No, not happening, right? But it's just a natural human thing. You don't want to lose, and you don't want to disappoint that whole family. So I think the natural way, God has natural safeguards in it if we tried to do things naturally. Now, I'm not saying that anybody who has less than 5 children or 4 children or 3 children is any less of a family, but I'm just saying back here, families were a lot larger. I think just about a generation ago, there were a lot of families that had 10 kids. Now, if you saw 10 kids in a family, people see that, they think they're weird. They're like some kind of a religious cult or something. Yeah. They got this bus and all these kids are coming out here. What is wrong with those people? How could they have 10 kids? So, let's move on. All right. Verse 2, and Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel and said, am I in God's stead? Who hath withheld from thee the fruit of the womb? So Jacob gets a little bit mad at Rachel here because she's blaming him. She says, give me children or I'm going to die. And he says, hey, am I God? I don't decide that. He obviously, it wasn't a problem with his fertility because he already had 4 children with Leah, so he knew it wasn't his medical issue or whatever. But so what we see here is God's actually in control, at least in these cases, and I think still today, of opening and closing wombs. It's He who either causes people not to have babies at a certain point for a certain reason, maybe for their own good or for His own plan, or decides to open the womb. And I think it's wise of us to try to follow the natural way instead of trying to go around it in certain ways. If people are having trouble having kids, I think the number one thing to do is to go to the Lord in prayer, like Rachel has been doing this whole time, and her prayer is going to finally be answered. Back in those days, they didn't have medical advances where she could try to do it anyways. Again, I'm not going to sit and judge that, but I would say there's many cases in the Bible where if you're having problems having kids, that going to God in prayer would be the number one thing rather than going to see the doctor right away. Maybe give it some time at least. All right, here we go. Verse 3, and she said, behold, my maid Bilhah, go in unto her, and she shall bear children upon my knees, that I may also have children by her. So Rachel's not having any children at this point. She's getting desperate. So she's got a handmaid named Bilhah, and he says, and she tells Jacob to go in and conceive a child with her. And what happened back in these days, evidently, it was that any children by somebody's handmaid would actually be the owner of the handmaid would be their child. In other words, Rachel would actually be the adoptive mother of whatever children Bilhah would have. And she gave him Bilhah, her handmaid, to wife, and Jacob went in unto her. Did I read that? I think I did. Oh, okay. And Bilhah conceived and bare Jacob a son. Continuing on, verse 6. And Rachel said, God hath judged me, and hath also heard my voice, and hath given me a son. Therefore called she his name Dan. Okay, so now Rachel says, well, God's vindicated me. He's heard my prayers, and now I have a child. His name is Dan, which means vindicated or judged, through my handmaid Bilhah. And Bilhah, Rachel's maid, conceived again and bare Jacob a second son. Okay, so now she's actually, technically she has 2, now it's 4-2 if you're keeping score. If you count the handmaids children. And Rachel said, with great wrestlings have I wrestled with my sister, and I have prevailed. And she called his name Naphtali. Naphtali means to prevail. So you can see here, this competition, they're really struggling with each other. And this is why I couldn't see this not happening in any polygamous relationship. There's going to be competition and jealousy and envy and things that are not healthy, okay? So Rachel feels like the tide has changed, and now she's winning. Kind of like, I don't want to liken this to like a basketball game or a hockey game, but the momentum has changed now in her favor, she believes. When Leah, verse 9, when Leah saw that she had left bearing, she took Zilpah, her maid, and gave her Jacob to wife. So now Leah, she's not bearing her own children. Her womb's not opening at this time. So she's trying to figure out a way to stay in this competition. So she gives her maid, Zilpah, to Jacob to produce children, more children for her. Verse 10, and Zilpah, Leah's maid, bare Jacob a son. And Leah said, a troop cometh, and she called his name Gad. So now she's kind of actually taunting her sister. So now she's saying, I got a whole army coming now. Gad, I'm the children, the numbers are getting to be on my side now. So here we go. And Zilpah, Leah's maid, bare Jacob a second son. Now I'm going to stop for a second here. This dramatic account of all these children, and they're being born in kind of a strange way that we would, in a way that we would consider strange anyways today in our culture. But all these children, you're not going to get to heaven without seeing the names of these children. If you go to heaven, you're going to have to see the names of these children on the gates. Because New Jerusalem, described in Revelation chapter 21 and 22, the names of the 12 tribes of Israel, their 12 sons of Jacob, are on the gates of that city. So these aren't just any old children. God's building a kingdom here that is actually going to be everlasting. And it is, and this kingdom actually has the names of these children on it. So it's a very special family here that God is building. Through an unconventional way. And you'll see God actually uses unconventional methods many times. It could look really chaotic, maybe even unnatural at times, but God's overseeing it for a specific purpose. And I think he almost does this at times to see if we're going to question him and say, God, how could you let that happen? I think he does that to test our obedience, to see if we'll stay in his word, or if we'll let some non-believer say, oh, you really believe in the Bible? What about all that polygamous relationships they had back then? How could your God be true? And I think God allows this kind of stuff in here so that we can be tested that way. Whether we are going to judge him and somehow say, how did you let this happen? You're unrighteous. Imagine any of us trying to tell God he's unrighteous. It's pretty silly thing to do when we think about all the things we've done. And to be able to tell him he doesn't know what he's doing or why did he allow this to happen would not be wise. Anyways, verse 13, and Leah said, happy am I, for the daughters will call me blessed. And she called his name Asher. So evidently, the more children you had at this time, you were looked upon with favor. Now she's thinking, I'm having all these children, all my lady friends, girlfriends, whatever you want to call them, are going to say that I'm so blessed, because I have all these children. Moving on. And Reuben, verse 14, and Reuben went in the days of wheat harvest and found mandrakes in the field. Now Reuben was Leah's firstborn son, and brought them unto his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, give me, I pray thee, thy son's mandrakes. Now what's the deal with these mandrakes? Many Bible scholars say that these mandrakes were something different than what mandrakes are today. Whatever these were, Rachel believed that these mandrakes, this plant or herb or whatever it was, somehow aided in fertility. And she really wants these mandrakes. Other people say that it was supposed to maybe get Jacob whatever the scent of it was supposed to, kind of, I guess maybe like perfume or something. Some people say it had those qualities that it would maybe attract Jacob to want to be with her. But anyways, I think I go more along the lines that they thought, or either they thought or this plant really did aid in fertility. At least she thought they did. That's the important part. So Leah's oldest son, Reuben, he finds these mandrakes, and Rachel wants them. Okay? And verse 15, whoops. Oh, I already read that, right? And she asked Reuben to give her the mandrakes. And she said unto her, verse 15, is it a small matter that thou hast taken my husband? That thou hast taken my husband? And wouldest thou take away my son's mandrakes also? And Rachel said, therefore he shall lie with thee tonight for thy son's mandrakes. Now, this is it's kind of a funny story, when you look at it. But anyways, so Rachel really wants these mandrakes because she has 0 of her own biological children with Jacob. And she thinks that if she gets these, she'll have children. So she's willing to buy them from Leah, barter, through the barter system, that it was her night to be with Jacob, but she's willing to give it up for the mandrakes. So she'll let Leah take her night to be with Jacob. Anyways, so that's what's happening. Evidently, they were that valuable to Rachel to be able to forfeit a night with her husband. And Jacob came out of the field in the evening. Okay, he's out working hard. And Leah went out to meet him and said, thou must come in unto me, for surely I have hired thee with my son's mandrakes. And he lie with her that night. Okay, so Leah came out to meet him as he was coming back from work. And she said, it's my turn to have you be with me in my tent tonight because I purchased that right from Rachel. She bought the mandrakes, okay? In verse 17, and God hearkened unto Leah, and she conceived and bare Jacob the 5th son. Now, like I said last week, this would make a pretty good blockbuster movie. This is, it's got all the elements in it. Just surprise, the jealousy, the envy, you name it. And then adding some of these strange twists to it, like this. So anyways, she conceived, there's a good deal for Leah. She actually now conceived from that night. And here we go. And Leah, verse 18, and Leah said, God hath given me my hire, because I have given my maiden to my husband. And she called his name Issachar. All right. I'll show a list here in a little bit. And Leah conceived again and bare Jacob the 6th son. Okay, so this wife that he loved less is having lots of children by him here. And Leah conceived. Okay, I read that. Verse 20. And Leah said, God hath endowed me with a good dowry. Now will my husband dwell with me, because I have borne him 6 sons. And she called his name Zebulun. Okay, so remember, Rachel just wants children, but Leah wants Jacob's attention and affection. So this is the struggle going on here. And because of these 2 needs of these women, Jacob is now multiplying himself, lots of children. And this was actually a promise that God gave to Abraham, that Abraham's seed would be as numerous as the stars of heaven and of the sands of the sea. So in this process of these, of all this back and forth and this competition, it's actually doing one thing. It's multiplying Jacob's seed, which would later become nations and kingdoms. And I believe, even today, that if it wasn't for this relation, these chapters today, that America wouldn't be here today. Because I really believe that the founders of America were actually biological descendants of these tribes that we're reading about today. Like I was talking to one of my kids that we started our homeschool out with a Bible study. And we were talking and we were reading about the history of the Israelites in the wilderness. They weren't doing so good then. But then one of my kids asked me, Lucy asked me, she goes, wait a minute, the Israelites are our ancestors? And I said, yeah, I really believe they are, because of all the blessings that God gave them actually you can see they transferred over to Christian Europe and then to America. They just followed it to a T. And her knowing that was just like, wow, now the Bible's a little bit more meaningful to me. This is my family. We could be reading about our ancestors right here. This could be you might think this is a weird start to a family. Well, it's probably the start of our family. This instance that we're reading about right now. Okay? So if you know, a lot of people, I don't know if any of you have family trees or genealogies and you do all that. Just think if you could trace them all the way back to this family. And, you know, many of us have genealogies that go back, you know, a couple hundred years, but you don't have, you know, detailed histories of our family, like what happened in their marriages and all the different, what did they do for an occupation. You might have little clips here and there, but here, if our ancestors trace back here, we actually have, this whole Bible is a detailed account of our family history. So it's fascinating. All right. Moving on. Verse 21, and afterwards she bare a daughter, and she called her name Dinah. So she has 6 sons, and now she has a daughter. This would actually be the only daughter of Jacob. Jacob would eventually have 12 sons and just 1 daughter. It must have been an interesting life for Dinah, having all these older brothers. You know, in one instance we see they were very protective of her, and actually went and had a little bit of a war to protect her dignity. We'll get into that later on, not today, but another chapter. Okay, so let's just see where we're at right now. Leah here. Oh, I think this is not where we're at.
You got one more verse to get there.
One more verse to get there. Okay. I put it in the wrong spot. All right. And God remembered Rachel and hearkened unto her and opened her womb. And she conceived and bare a son, and said, God hath taken away my reproach, and called his name Joseph, and said, the Lord shall add to me another son. I'm just going to go back here, and I'll get back to there. I want to look at that slide. Okay, so Rachel finally has her own biological son. But look at Leah's scorecard. Pretty impressive compared to Rachel's. So Leah had 7 children of her own, 2 adopted children through her handmaid Zilpah, Gad and Asher. Rachel just had 1 son, Joseph, and she'll have another one later on, be Benjamin. That'll be another story. But Bilhah, then through her 2 adoptive sons through Bilhah would be Dan and Naphtali. Okay, so, all right. Now I'll try to go back to where I was there. Or wait, what verse am I on?
26.
26?
Maybe 25.
Okay. So what happened? Did Rachel, did she need to go do a different, did she need to come up with some other way to get her own, to finally get her own children? No, she was patient and she waited, and she even all those years. That was a lot of years. I think it was like 14 years or something. Almost 14 years that she was not having any children. That was a long time to wait. But eventually, God opened her womb, and she was able to have children, the exact amount of children that God wanted her to have. Verse 26. Give me my wives, here's Jacob now. He says, give me my wives and my children, for whom I have served thee, and let me go, for thou knowest my service which I have done thee. So now, remember, Jacob served Laban 7 years or 14 years for his 2 daughters, Leah and Rachel. And I think he worked about another 7 years after that. So it's been about 21 years. And now he's got to the point, he's got his family, most of his children, all but 1. And he doesn't want to be under his father-in-law's shadow now. He wants to have his own room, his own space, and this is natural. He wants to build his own kingdom, so to speak. He doesn't want to have to wake up every morning and have Laban looking over him and being his boss. Jacob now wants to make his own way. He wants to be his own boss and have that freedom, okay, that natural desire for freedom. And he definitely earned it. He deserved it. He even worked overtime here. Verse 27, and Laban said unto him, I pray thee, if I have found favor in thine eyes, tarry, for I have learned by experience that the Lord hath blessed me for thy sake. Now think about this. Jacob did possess the blessings of God, the blessings of Abraham. And whatever Jacob did, flourished. It produced results. And Laban knew this. Even though Laban was kind of a shady guy, he did not want to lose Jacob because Jacob was making him rich. And that's Laban was kind of a greedy guy in that sense. He wasn't thinking about what his son-in-law, what would be good for his son-in-law. He was just thinking about what would be good for him. You know, he's making me rich. I want to keep him here. But anyways, you look at America's beginning. I mean, our founding fathers, it seems like there was good times and bad times, and there were with these Israelites back then. But just look at the technological advances. Everything they touched basically turned to gold. This nation it's the most powerful, most blessed nation in the world. In fact, we actually feed most of the world with the crops that we grow here in America. A lot of people don't know that. They think that every country, they grow their own crops and feed their own people. No, we actually supplement many countries with food that they wouldn't have otherwise. But the point is if God's blessing a people, if He chooses a person or chooses a nation for a specific purpose, His blessings will be evident. You'll see them, that they will flourish. Okay, verse 28, and he said, appoint me thy wages, and I will give it. So Laban's he's saying, hey, just stay with me, keep working, just tell me your wages, I'll just give you whatever you think is fair. But Jacob obviously didn't want to stay there. And he said unto him, thou knowest how I have served thee, and how thy cattle was with me. For it was a little which thou hadst before I came, and now increased into a multitude, and the Lord hath blessed thee since my coming. And now when shall I provide for my own house also? So Jacob acknowledges this. He says, yeah, God has blessed you since I've been here. You started out with a lot less than you have now. But then Jacob says, but I need to provide for my own family. I need to be free to not be under your shadow. Okay. Verse 31, and he said, what shall I give thee? And Jacob said, thou shalt not give me anything. If thou wilt do this thing for me, I will again feed and keep thy flock. And I will pass through all thy flock today, removing from thence all the speckled and spotted cattle, and all the brown cattle among the sheep, and the spotted and speckled among the goats, and of such shall be my hire. Okay, so this is actually a pretty good deal on the surface for Laban. Jacob is saying, hey, I'll basically take all the less desirable sheep and cattle, and I'll let you have the best. Okay, so I'll take the spotted ones and the speckled ones, and you'll take the best. All right, verse 33. So shall my righteousness answer for me in time to come, when it shall come from my hire before thy face, every one that is not speckled and spotted among the goats, and brown among the sheep, that shall be counted stolen with me. And Laban said, behold, I would it might be according to thy word. So they made an agreement on this. Jacob would take the less desirable cattle, the spotted ones, the speckled ones, and so forth. And verse 35, and he removed that day the he-goats that were ring-straked and spotted, and all the she-goats that were speckled and spotted, and every one that had some white in it, and all the brown among his sheep, and gave them into the hand of his sons. And he set 3 days' journey betwixt himself and Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flocks. And Jacob took him rods of green poplar, and of hazel and chestnut trees, and pilled them, and pilled white strakes in them, and made the white appear which was in the rod. So he takes these sticks, and he's like peeling off the bark for some reason here. We're going to find out in the next chapter, not today, that God actually told him to do this. Verse 38, and he set the rods which he had pilled that he had stripped before the flocks in the gutters in the watering trough when the flocks came to drink, that they should conceive when they came to drink. So not only is this chapter about the conception of Jacob's children, now it's the conception of his cattle. So this is all talking about Jacob multiplying in children and in wealth. Okay, children and in wealth. So he's coming up with a strategy here, and like I said, God told him to do it this way. He hasn't revealed that yet. He's coming up with a strategy to make these undesirable cattle and sheep and whatever he has. He's coming up with a way to multiply them. And so we're going to see what happens here. Verse 39, and the flocks conceived before the rods and brought forth cattle, ring-straked, speckled, and spotted. So now all the new babies are not the kind that Laban would keep. They're the kind that belong to Jacob. And verse 40, and Jacob did separate the lambs and set the faces of the flocks toward the ring-straked. He's purposely trying to get them to mate with the right ones. And all the brown in the flock of Laban, and he put his own flocks by themselves and put them not unto Laban's cattle. So he kept his separate from Laban, so there wouldn't be producing for Laban, only be producing for him. And it came to pass, whensoever the stronger cattle did conceive, that Jacob laid the rods before the eyes of the cattle in the gutters, that they might conceive among the rods. So he's getting the strong cattle to bear other cattle that would be his, okay, from the strong. But when the cattle were feeble, the smaller ones, weaker ones, whatever, he put them not in, so the feebler were Laban's and the stronger Jacob's. So, all right, verse 43. And the man increased exceedingly and had much cattle and maidservants and men servants and camels and asses. Now remember, this is all because he had the blessing of Abraham upon him that this was coming to pass. So, I mean, he was just growing like crazy, Jacob was. Again, in children, in wealth, and so on. All right. So anyways, in conclusion here, we talked about, God has his own ways of making things come to pass, and sometimes we look at the ways as kind of strange, and we question them and wonder, why would he allow something like that to happen? For instance, polygamy. Let's talk about this for a minute. Why would God allow this polygamous relationship to come to be the foundation of his kingdom on earth, so to speak, as far as the children of Israel are concerned? Well, I got one theory on that. And so Jacob, at this time, remember, there were the Canaanites that lived right by Jacob, or before Jacob went to find Rachel, he lived among the Canaanite women. There weren't hardly any godly women left in the world. And there was basically one line left in the world at this time, and that was of his own kindred. His uncle, Rachel, was his first cousin. Laban was his uncle. And so if Jacob would have had only children through Rachel, there might have been a little bit of problem with the DNA. You know, if you're building a foundation of a family, and because they're going to keep intermarrying with each other. Now we know today that if first cousins have children with each other, there's a lot more chances that there's going to be birth defects and things like that. Because if there are defects in your DNA of one person and they match the DNA of the other person, that's when the birth defects happen, is if you have the same defects that match together. But so long and short of it is, the more variety that Jacob had at the starting point of this family would actually be healthy for the DNA of the Israelites, so that they weren't being born with birth defects and other problems. And that later on these tribes could intermarry with each other, and there'd be enough variety and enough DNA where that wouldn't be an issue. I believe that's probably why God did this at this time, why he approved of it, because it was a cultural thing at the time. But God sometimes has a way of using the culture to benefit his plan. So, like some people would say, well, why was Jacob permitted to have more than one wife, but we're not today? They'd say, well, it doesn't make any sense. Well, I think God was using the weaknesses of the culture and taking advantage of it to make his will come to pass. We find in other situations in the Bible where God used unconventional methods, like he used Samson, who was a very kind of what you consider an ungodly man, to actually rescue the Israelites. And so there are examples after examples of God using different methods to make his will come to pass. And that's about all I have. Anybody have any questions or comments? John, could you handle more than one wife?
Nope, that's not a good question.
You know, a lot of people think this would,
More than one person handle John.
You know, a lot of guys, you know how young guys are. They say, "Oh, that'd be great. I wish I was Jacob." But think about that. Could you imagine dealing with the emotions of 4 women that are fighting each other? Or there's 2 women. So I don't think it was still kind of it wasn't. Jacob didn't have the easy life, I don't think. I think it was a little bit more stressful than we imagined.
I have a question. When that cutoff was it after Jesus? Where it was no longer, because in the Old Testament, they had a lot of wives.
Right.
In fact, the Muslims, they believe in that.
Right.
They still believe in that.
The main argument...
They're in the Old Testament.
Right. The main argument that people have is that, God made Adam and Eve just one man, one woman, and that it was always supposed to be like that. It's just that man violated God's natural way of that. And then God
times in the Old Testament.
Right. And God permitted it in certain circumstances like this. He didn't come down and stop it. In fact, it actually seemed like he encouraged it here.
Because he opened her womb.
Yeah. Yeah, if he was opening wombs, yeah.
There's clearly scriptures in the New Testament that say that's not the way it's supposed to be.
That's what
Right.
is there.
I think definitely the cutoff would be if you thought it was legal in the Old Testament, it's not anymore in the New Testament, because I think Jesus...
Because of Jesus.
I think he quoted, when he was referring to marriage, he quoted back to Adam and Eve in the garden, one man and one woman. But this is, it's important to know as much as we can about this, because non-believers will try to find these kinds of passages and they'll try to discredit Christianity. And if we don't research it enough to have some, you're not going to always be able to have answers for them, but the more answers we have, the better, even for ourselves. So we're not, shaken and think, how could the Bible say something like this, and then throw the whole thing out, because people do that. I think the one big, the homosexual extremists, or whatever you want to call them, the LGBT activists, they always quote, because there's a scripture in Leviticus that says that if a man lies with a man or a woman lies with a woman, that it's an abomination. Well, then they say, yeah, I know it says that, but it also says that if someone wears, 2 kinds of different fibers in their clothes, wool and linen or something like that, that's an abomination as well. And they go, ha, 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 see, you can't believe the Bible. But then they never stop to understand what the purpose of them not wearing the mixed clothes was in the first place. So it's just an easy way for them to try to mock and ridicule the Bible.
I like the detail that God gives in his stories, because he doesn't have to be detailed. He could just say that this happened, they had this many kids, move on. But, the detail is incredible, and it really puts you there.
Right.
You can tell it's another example of that, God has his hand in the scripture.
And when we get to the New Jerusalem, heavenly Jerusalem, the names of those 12 tribes actually still remind us of this story back here, because each child was named based off of what was going on. Like Gad, a troop is coming. So when you're going to remember that story, that family history of the Israelites, as you walk around that city, just by the names of the children. They weren't just randomly named, like I'm going to name him John or Pete or something. It was, there was a reason why each child had a name.
Christian Overcomers is brought to you by the tithes and offerings of our listeners. If you would like to support our ministry, please go to ChristianOvercomers.com. God bless you, and thank Thank you for your support.
Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He has loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible swift sword.